All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really charged and honestly highly polemical critique of the modern Ethiopian state and its Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Now, understanding this specific framework is absolutely crucial if you're trying to grasp the historical narrative building behind what is, frankly, one of the most complex geopolitical crises in the world right now. We're going to unpack a source text that lays out a very severe, unyielding perspective on the conflicts in the Horn of Africa. And just to be super clear right up front, the views we're exploring today, they belong entirely to the author. Our goal here is just to neutrally map out this intense ideological debate so you can see exactly where they're coming from.
Okay, let's dive right into it. The core thesis of this paper doesn't pull any punches. They argue that the current government isn't overseeing some democratic transition at all. Instead, the author calls it a retro-fascist resurgence. According to this view, the administration's main goal is to reimpose absolute hegemony, basically total, unquestioned dominance, rooted in the old Abyssinian Empire. So, yeah, this is an intense accusation, and it really sets the stage for everything we're about to cover.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the retro-fascist thesis. Then, the roots of Abyssinian expansion. Third, the One Ethiopia doctrine. Fourth, parallels to historical fascism. And finally, the nostalgia for imperial autocracy. Let's get into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the retro-fascist thesis. Now, the author has a very specific definition of retro-fascism. Usually when we think of traditional fascism, we picture a movement looking towards some futuristic, hyper-industrial utopia, right? Well, this modern iteration does the exact opposite. It looks backward. It's defined by this deep, almost romanticized nostalgia for an autocratic feudal era. The paper argues that the regime uses this idealized version of the past to legitimize contemporary state violence and what the author describes as eliminatory policies against indigenous populations today.
Which brings us to Section 2, Roots of Abyssinian Expansion.
To understand the author's critique of the present, we really have to look at the past. The claim here is that modern Ethiopia is actually built on a predatory settler colonial empire that started in a northern Amhara-Tigray core. So, looking at the timeline, it starts with the warlord Tawadros, continues through Yohannes, and peaks under Menelik. The paper alleges this whole era relied heavily on captive labor and the slave trade to expand. So rather than unifying a fractured nation, which is the common historical narrative, the author argues this period was strictly about violently conquering independent indigenous populations. And that brings us to this massive number, 715,000. That is the staggering amount of European rifles Emperor Menelik reportedly got his hands on between 1868 and 1900. I mean, that is an unbelievable amount of unprecedented firepower. And it wasn't just rifles. This came alongside 50 million rounds of ammunition, plus military experts and mercenaries from global powers, places like Britain, France, Italy, and Russia. Why does this matter? Well, the author points out that these European weapons were literally the only reason the Abyssinian core was able to colonize the south. Because before this massive influx of foreign guns, Abyssinian forces were reportedly pushed back time and time again by the Galana Tulama Oromo cavalry. But once they were armed with those 715,000 rifles, their territory exploded, expanding 5 to 6 times over. They forcefully subjugated vast indigenous nations like the Oromo, Sidama, Afar, and Somali, locking them into this highly centralized extractive system.
Moving on to Section 3, the One Ethiopia doctrine. So how does that history translate today? Think of this modern doctrine of Ethiopiawinet, or One Ethiopia, as a total ideological 180 from the country's recent past. The paper doesn't view this as a unifying, feel-good national sentiment. Actually, scratch that, they view it as a totalitarian paradigm. The author argues that this One Ethiopia idea is basically a mask for an uncompromising assimilation agenda, an agenda demanding the complete erasure of multinational federalism, indigenous rights, and the ethnic autonomy that was actually constitutionally guaranteed back in 1995.
So the crucial point is, how does this doctrine actually play out in reality according to the text? The author lays out 3 devastating consequences. First up, pluralism is criminalized. Just recognizing distinct nations is vilified as treason. Second, cultural hegemony is mandated. Basically, Amharic Abyssinian cultural norms and their specific historical narratives are forcefully set as the absolute baseline for what makes a true citizen. And finally, dissent is completely eradicated through state violence and extrajudicial action. This takes us to Section 4, Parallels to Historical Fascism.
All right, just a heads up, we're now stepping into the author's most intensely polemical comparisons. They map contemporary Ethiopian policies directly onto 20th century European fascism. And this brilliantly illustrates how the author connects the dots. The One Ethiopia doctrine, likened straight to the Aryan supremacist ideal of the Nazi people's community. State media rhetoric, which has sometimes labeled minorities as weeds or cancer, is compared directly to Goebbels' propaganda ministry. The government's use of ethnic militias, like the Fano, is equated to the SA&SS paramilitaries. And lastly, the author bluntly equates the blockade and weaponized starvation in Tigray to Nazi hunger plans in Eastern Europe. To really hammer home this claim of genocidal intent, the paper brings up a deeply disturbing quote, allegedly from a party official: "We must dry the ocean to kill fish." Now, the author interprets this in a very specific, chilling way. The fish represents the Oromo Liberation Army, and the ocean is the entire Oromo nation. For the author, this rhetoric is literal proof that the state is willing to wipe out entire populations just to crush political resistance. Finally, we reach Section 5, Nostalgia for Imperial Autocracy. So tying it all together, unlike classical 20th century fascism, which, was obsessed with forging this futuristic industrial machine, the author claims this current regime is inherently retrogressive. It's entirely backward-looking. The paper argues the administration is yearning for a romanticized past of absolute feudal monarchs and totally unquestioned imperial authority. And they say this is heavily driven by Abiy Ahmed's own personal megalomania and this messianic rhetoric about somehow saving the ancient empire. To achieve this leap back in time, the text claims the government conceptually leans heavily on the 1931 feudal constitution. The author breaks down the creation of this constitution as basically a legally manufactured myth. Step 1. They allege it was plagiarized, straight from the Meiji Empire of Japan and Tsarist Russia. Step 2. European mentors actually advised changing the empire's name from Abyssinia to Ethiopia just to fake a more ancient lineage. And Step 3, enacting Article 1, which legally forced all indigenous natives under the emperor's absolute control. Which brings us to a really sobering data point from the text, 130 million. The author emphasizes that we aren't just talking about ancient history here. According to the paper, an estimated 130 million people today, spanning multiple generations, are actively caught up in this coercive, violent framework and are being systematically denied genuine self-determination and cultural survival. And we'll wrap up the explainer with this really provocative question, drawn straight from the core themes of the paper. If modern state building relies on rewriting brutal colonial conquests as acts of heroism and unification, can the 130 million people ensnared within it ever achieve genuine self-determination? It's a heavy, incredibly complex idea to ponder, one that fundamentally challenges the foundational myths of the Ethiopian state. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack this challenging material today, and remember to always keep questioning the narratives that shape our world.